government, by the Taliban government, by Wakil Ahmed Mutawakel and Mullah Omar, the leaders over there who have commented today, in which they denied that Osama bin Laden has ever organized terrorism out of Afghan territory. One official calling that lies, 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 lies. And there's a certain amount of black humor also now setting in as, like other Americans, national security officials, intelligence officials, the first thing they felt when they saw what's happening and what we're looking at on our screen here was shock. But that is turning now to anger. And when I asked whether there were considerations being given to some sort of retaliation against targets in Afghanistan, one official said, "I wouldn't be planning your vacation there if I were you."
David Ensor, just quickly, when they describe this new and specific information, do you know enough about the kinds of sources or the kinds of the methods here that you could characterize where this information might be coming from or in what form?
Well, they are not saying anything specific about exactly what the nature of this information is, as you can expect, Judy. However, when I talk to officials about the kinds of information that they would be gathering now, they confirm that that information includes passenger lists of the aircraft that were downed, videotape at airports from cameras, from security cameras in the airports. In a few days, they will have cockpit recordings. And there's also a limited number of people who are suspected of belonging to terrorist groups who are known to be able to fly aircraft. And it looks as if at least some of the personnel involved in this plot must have been able to do that in order to carry off this set of attacks, Judy.
Absolutely chilling to hear you say that, David, that there are people in these organizations, and we now know it, who could fly commercial jetliners to do these horrible, unspeakable acts that have been committed today in the United States. And now, as we look at live pictures of New York City, where the smoke still billows from the location of the World Trade Center's buildings that were 100 stories high, now completely decimated. Smoke coming from those buildings 6 hours after the collapse of these Twin Towers. To Atlanta and to my colleague Joey Chin.
Judy, we want to bring our viewers up to date. Of course, it's just after the top of the hour, and many people are probably tuning in at the top of the hour trying to understand the events of the day. So we want to bring you up to date on what we know, what we've been able to learn throughout the course of the day's events. There were two airliners just about 18 minutes apart this morning, which crashed into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center at separate times. Both planes apparently had been hijacked. One of them was an American Airlines flight. The other is believed to have been a United Airlines aircraft. Now, the buildings collapsed not long after the attacks, and as you see, the people in the streets below just were rained on with the debris from these collapsing buildings. There are tens of thousands of people in these buildings on any given day at the World Trade Center, but officials say they do not yet know how many people may have been killed, and they do not want to venture a guess until they know more, until they have more solid information about what's happening. Again, the effort still to control the fire at the World Trade Center. Now, about a half hour after the second attack in New York, an American Airlines jet crashed into the Pentagon building. You see it there. Again, the plane was believed to have been hijacked as well. The building has burned throughout the day as firefighters have worked, trying very hard to get the blaze under control. Parts of the Pentagon building, you see it there, have collapsed. The casualties there are expected to be high, but again, we don't have any firm numbers yet on that. About the same time, a fourth plane was hijacked this morning. This one was believed to be a United flight from Newark, New Jersey, bound for San Francisco, and then it crashed in western Pennsylvania, about 80 miles south-southeast of Pittsburgh. Again, CNN continuing to follow up on all fronts. We want to return now to New York, and from his rooftop vantage point, CNN's Aaron Brown. Aaron?
Joey, thank you. Shimon Peres, the Israeli foreign minister, has been active in Israeli governments for as long as most of us can remember, and has witnessed more of these terrorist attacks than any of us should experience. He joins us now to talk about this one. Good evening, sir. Thank you for joining us.
Good evening. Thank you.
Before, sir, we get to any of the specific questions, let me just ask you first, if I may, for a reaction to what has taken place here.
Our heart is with America, and our heart is with the thousands of families that have lost their children, their brothers, mothers. For Israel, it's a day of mourning. We announced that tomorrow the whole nation will be mourning. And I'm sure that as bitter and painful the event is, the only one that can save humanity from this terrible danger is the United States of America. It was not an attack only upon America, but an attack upon civilization, an attempt to introduce the rules of jungle in our life, not to permit people to fly freely, to walk safely, to be assured at the places they live. It is like a declaration of war or an introduction of a terrible arm, and we have to draw all the conclusions fully, uncompromisingly, and right away.
Sir, you have been a soldier, a leader of a country. You have been privy to some of the most detailed intelligence reports there are out there. Are you surprised by the sophistication that must have been at play to carry out these attacks?
It's a sophistication of the most evil kind. You know, only evil people can arrive to such a sophistication. And the measures must be radical as the evil itself. I think what should be done is to identify every country that hosts or supports terror and declare those countries as terrorist countries. I think there must be a call to all religious leaders, Christian, Muslim, Jewish, to condemn fully, without an excuse, all the suicidal bombers, suicidal persons, who in order to kill others, they kill themselves. It's against the basis of our life. It's against the gospels of every believer. And then again, we have to organize ourselves globally, because we are going over from a world of enemies, where you have had armies to face them, to a world of global dangers that we don't have yet neither a strategy nor an army to stop it. We have to get ourselves organized properly and fully and immediately.
Mr. Foreign Minister, I hope you'll answer this. Let me ask it anyway. Did the government of Israel have any intelligence prior, any indications prior that something like this might happen?
Not specifically. We have had warnings, and there are all the time warnings. But we know, and all of us are aware of some of the addresses from where terror can origin. But anyway, I don't have any specific information, and I wouldn't like to blame anybody without full knowledge.
I understand that, and let me then, just for the record, ask the logical follow-up, which is, since the attacks themselves, has Israeli intelligence picked up any information that suggests who might be involved in this?
Any information we shall have, we shall hand over immediately to our American friends. And we also send right now, you know, a plane with our rescue team, which is already on the way. Whatever we shall be able to do, we can do, in order to be of help, we shall do it full-heartedly, without any reservations. Permit me to say that today each of us feels American, like an American, with all the seriousness, all the pains, and all the determination.
Sir, do you have any doubt in your mind that the root of this attack on the United States today, the root of it took place in the Middle East, that the events in the Middle East, the organizations in the Middle East, do you believe that to be the case?
I think we have to bring an end to the conflict in the Middle East, but you know, there were already acts of terror in the United States disconnected from the Middle East, and there are in many other places the same story. We have to put an end to terror, because it's a danger to every person and every country, no matter where it is. So the reasons are important, but the attraction to use terror in order to kill in order to threaten is existing everywhere. It's not connected to a specific case or specific place.
Sir, thank you. Shimon Peres, the Israeli foreign minister, a long-time Israeli leader in any number of governments, joining us from Jerusalem tonight, where it is a little bit after 11 o'clock, about 10 minutes after 11. Thank you, sir, for joining us. We are getting information now that one of the other buildings, Building 7 in the World Trade Center complex, is on fire and has either collapsed or is collapsing. And you, to be honest, can see these pictures a little bit more clearly than I. But building number 7, one of the buildings in this very large complex of buildings that is the Trade Center, there were, and that is the right way to put it, there were the 2 towers, but then there are a number of support buildings around it, retail spaces, restaurants, office space, garages. The trains come in from New Jersey, bringing commuters, taking commuters back, come into the complex that is the World Trade Center. And now we are told that there's a fire there, and that building may collapse as well, as you can see. We can see, as we look now back downtown, we can see the billowing smoke. It is extraordinary to us, I guess, is how long this scene has gone on. The smoke has not cleared at all. It has not lightened at all. There was that horrific moment when the towers collapsed, and then we've been in this sort of situation ever since, as the fires continue to burn. Rose Arce, one of our producers who has been slowly and diligently making her way to the building, described the fires that she saw in the area of the towers themselves. And clearly those fires continue to burn at about 4:15 Eastern Daylight Time today, in an unbelievable and awful scene in New York. Judy?
Aaron, for those of us who don't know that area of Lower Manhattan, you are explaining something that is important, because I think the belief had been that there were just the 2 towers, but you're now telling us that there are several other buildings that make up the complex of buildings. And as Aaron is just saying, and we're hearing for the first time, one of these support buildings is on the verge of collapse, if it has not already collapsed. It looks to me, as it may to Aaron as well, with these live pictures, that smoke is so black that it may be the result of a fresh part of this terrible disaster. But it is only speculation at this point. We evidently don't have anyone on the phone down there that we can get to right this moment. But of course, when we do, we will tell you what is going on. We do know that every effort is being made by New York emergency authorities to get people out. But you also heard our producer Rose Arce say not too long ago that even the emergency personnel cannot get close because debris is falling at a steady rate within a 2-block radius around the Trade Center. And even their most heartfelt efforts to get in there and rescue people, they just can't do it because the risk is too great. We're going to continue to watch this horrific scene in New York City as we bring you up to date on what has been happening here in Washington. The Congress would have been in session today. In fact, it was gaveled to order this morning. At least that's my understanding. But members of Congress, after these buildings were hit, were quickly evacuated. And some of them have been gathering. There was a report not too long ago that at 6 o'clock today Eastern Time that there would be a conference call of the congressional leadership to assess the catastrophe of today and to consider when the United States Congress should meet again. As of now, the Capitol was largely evacuated. CNN's Kate Snow is at a location near the Capitol, and she's been talking constantly to members and to members of the staff. Kate, what are you learning?
Judy, we are still under a lockdown at the Capitol. We've been told that Senator Lott and Senator Daschle would like to call the Senate back into session this afternoon. They would like to do that. Whether that's going to be a possibility is unclear at this point. Joining me here a couple of blocks away from the Capitol is Senator Bob Graham. Democrat from Florida and the chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee. You hold a position where you are in the know, Senator. Tell us, what do you know at this point about the events that have transpired today? Have you been briefed yet?
Kate, we're about to have a briefing. The head of the CIA has been briefing the cabinet and the other key officials to the president this afternoon, and he's going to be talking to members of Congress on the intelligence committees and leadership shortly.
It's been reported, our David Ensor has reported, that there are strong indications that this could be linked to Osama bin Laden. Do you personally believe that that could be the case?
Kate, I think it's premature to start naming a prime suspect. If you'll recall, after the Oklahoma City bombing, there was an early identification of an Arab group that had done it. It turned out to be false. Let's withhold until we get a little more information. My own sense is that there are not very many groups around the world who have the capability of planning, coordinating, and executing a terrorist attack of this sophistication.
You are constantly being briefed by the FBI, by the CIA, by the National Security Agency. You are one of the senators that knows the most about our national security. Do you believe that there was any advance warning of this attack?
No. If there had been advance warning, there would have been steps taken to have interdicted it. There had been a general threat warning that there was a greater likelihood of some terrorist attack somewhere in the United States, but it was not at a sufficiently detailed level to allow for some response.
And when was that general warning?
Early in the summer, there was a general announcement of an increase in threat level for terrorism.
And were there changes made then to our security? Tell me about that.
Yes, there were general steps taken in terms of our intelligence gathering, particularly related to those that we had the highest level of suspicion, greater security at key vulnerable areas, and I'm certain that the military was placed at a somewhat higher level of alert.
Were you then surprised as you sat in your office? You told me you were here this morning, you were on Capitol Hill when the first word started coming down about what happened in New York. Were you surprised?
Well, the answer is I was shocked at what actually happened, that the extent of it, the gruesomeness, the audaciousness of this kind of an aerial attack against some of our best known symbols of America. I was not surprised that there was an attack, was surprised at the specificity of this one.
Does the Senate now, to show that the Senate can get on with business and that the U.S. Congress has not been impeded, do you think the Senate ought to come back and get back to business to send that signal?
Well, I think first, as all Americans, we need to extend our sympathy to the families that have been so tragically affected by this. We also need to send a signal to the world that a group of terrorists cannot intimidate the greatest democracy in the history of the globe, and that we will continue to carry out our responsibilities.
And at this briefing, you told me within the hour, before 5 o'clock Eastern, you expect to talk not only with intelligence, FBI, but also with your colleagues, the leadership. And I understand some decisions are going to be made about how to proceed from here.
Well, I think what we'll be getting at this briefing is some more detail as to what happened today. But there clearly are some things that we have known that need to be undertaken for our long-term protection. For instance, we need to make a greater investment in human intelligence. That's old-fashioned spies that can get close to a terrorist, find out what their intentions and motivations are. We need to see that our technical ability to gather information stays as world-class as it has been for the last 50 years, and we need to close the gap between the amount of information we gather and that which we're able to analyze and convert into useful intelligence.
Okay. Senator Bob Graham, Democrat from Florida, the chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, joining us here. He's about to receive a briefing, Judy, and we will get back to you with word when we know more from here. Judy?
All right, Kate, we've been listening closely to what Senator Graham was saying, and I would just remind everyone, if they haven't already taken note of this, that this week is actually the anniversary of the Camp David Accords. Those took place back in 1978, 23 years ago, over a period of about a little more than a week between September 5th and about the 17th. This was the framework for peace in the Middle East, an agreement between Israel and Egypt that many of the more hardline Arab states said they would never forgive Egypt and certainly Israel for doing this. They felt betrayed by it, and there are those today suggesting perhaps that had something to do with the timing, although at this point it would be purely speculation to say one way or another. You're continuing to see pictures of the terrible devastation in New York City in the aftermath of the 2 airplanes that flew into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center. There are adjacent buildings, part of the World Trade Center complex, that are still very much at risk. One of these buildings may have collapsed or may be in the process of collapsing. Aaron Brown, back to you in Manhattan.
Judy, thank you. Jim DeStefano is a structural engineer. He knows about big buildings and what happens in these sort of catastrophic moments. He joins us from Deerfield, Connecticut on the phone. Jim, the plane hits. And I hope this isn't a terribly oversimplified question, but what happens to the building itself?
Well,
it's a structure.
Yeah, it's a tremendous impact that's applied to the building when a collision like this occurs. And it's clear that that impact was sufficient to do damage to the columns and the bracing system supporting the building. That, coupled with the fire raging and the high temperatures softening the structural steel, then precipitated a destabilization of the columns, and clearly the columns buckled at the lower floors, causing the building to collapse.
So it is a combination of, as we see again this extraordinary shot of the second plane hitting the tower, it is a combination of the impact of the plane itself and then the fire that ensues that causes these, I don't know, are they called beams, to buckle?
It's the columns. The vertical elements are columns, and those are the elements that are holding the whole building up. And those are the critical, vulnerable elements that clearly failed in a buckling mode from the high temperatures and the damage from the impact.
Now, I'm not asking you to assign any blame to anyone about anything here, but just give me an idea if, in fact, you can design these buildings in such a way so that this sort of thing does not happen even in a catastrophic event.
Well, it's very difficult when you're designing a structure like this to imagine all the scenarios of things that might occur to the building during its construction. It's my understanding that when this building was designed, one of the criteria that it was designed for was a direct hit from a 707. Clearly, planes are larger today, and it wasn't considered the effects of the aftermath fires and high temperatures that would have been applied to the structure subsequent to the collision, as we saw today.
And to the best that you can, give me an idea of how long it will take for that building to be safe to go into, because what we know is or what we believe at least, there are still people trapped in there. The mayor talked about a week that this rescue operation is going to take. Is that realistic?
I think it's very realistic that what we've seen in other collapses, like L'Ambiance Plaza here in Connecticut and the Hyatt Regency in Kansas City and the Oklahoma City bombing, it takes a very long time to clear the rubble and find all the people that might be trapped underneath it.
But at what point, what has to happen before it is literally safe to send someone into that space?
I don't know that it will ever be safe. I think the rescue people that are in there trying to save people are very much at risk, as they always are in these kinds of disasters. That the structure is always, when you have a pile of rubble like this, the structure is always somewhat unstable. So those rescue workers that are in there are at some risk. That there's never a point where you can say this building is safe to walk into and start looking around.
Jim, thank you. Jim DeStefano, a structural engineer, joining us from Deerfield, Connecticut on the phone. We have, over the last 6 or 7 hours now, shown you some extraordinary pictures, many of those Pictures have come from the air. We have seen the plane hitting the tower. We've seen the tower collapse. In this day and age, lots of people walk around this city, and every city, I guess, with video cameras, and one of them today in Lower Manhattan was Dr. Mark Heath. Dr. Heath kept rolling, as we say in the news business, and this is what he saw with as little commentary from us as possible.
I hope I live. It's coming down on me. Here it comes. I'm getting behind a car. It's incredible. Okay, I'm gonna have to go find people who need help. I don't think I'm one of them. You okay, sir? Okay. Can I just get a toot off your respirator? Can I get a toot? I'm just getting a couple of clean breaths. That's good. Okay. Back to you. This is the car I hid behind. It saved my life. Oh, wait, maybe it was this one. There's all these noises. I don't know what it is. They say someone needs help.
Yeah, Mike! Mike! Mike, come over here! Yeah!
Anybody need a doctor?
Where are you?
Oxygen. Don't have oxygen.
Hello, Doc.
Hey, that guy needs some oxygen if someone can share it with him.
10-4.
Thanks. They told me just to wait here at this semi-staging area. See if I can help, and that's what I'm doing. They won't let me go any closer. No one can go in to get the people out. There's small explosions still going on. So far, I just seen some people who needed oxygen from the dust. No one trauma. Gonna go wash my eyes out. Yeah, that almost made it worse. Looking north on the West Side Highway. You guys going in?
Yeah.
Come with you. You know, you might not want to get too much closer, because the more buildings could come down, then we're not going to help anybody.
All right.
I think we should. Yeah.
Where's the incident come out?
Let's just.
Oxygen.
Yeah. Okay. Let's just wait right here. Let's just station up right here. Okay.
All right, Doc.
Why don't we set up? Can you hang IVs from this pole here?
Okay.
Okay.
George, get gloves there, buddy.
Yeah. We just heard another explosion. They're handing out gloves and masks. The consensus is it's too unsafe to go in there. Just going to wait here until they bring some people out. I was hooked up with some firemen with some first aid stuff. What do we do? You know what? Anything? Why don't we just set this up as a little mobile hospital unit right here, okay?
Hold on to try to get to all units that are available. We're going to have a new command post on Murray Street and West Street. Any units available, report it when you're all up here.
Any suggestions? Should we set up here for medical work? Think this is safe enough here?
Those pictures shot by Dr. Mark Heath. We don't know much about Dr. Heath, but we, I think, can fairly say that he had extraordinary presence of mind as he continued not only shooting those pictures, but also offering assistance where he could. At one point, he hid behind a car, tried to get into the car to protect himself from both the debris and the smoke that was building around him. The car was locked. He tried to break in, couldn't, and then hid his face in a medical bag, his medical bag. All the while he kept shooting. A couple of things that you might have wondered about. A couple of sounds. There was a chirping sound that you heard at various points in the tape. That is the sound of the locator devices that firemen and women wear so that if they are lost in a fire, their colleagues, their brother and sister firefighters can get to them. And there was also a kind, what sounded to us at least, like a kind of whistling sound. That's the sound of respirators that the firemen, the emergency service personnel, and the rest were using and offering to people who needed it. Our colleagues at CNN-FN are reporting now that the stock exchanges, the NASDAQ, the American Stock Exchange, the New York Stock Exchange, all of course closed today, will remain closed through Wednesday. So the stock markets, the financial markets in the country, and yet again, we cannot recall anything like that ever occurring. Perhaps it has, and we don't remember it, but we don't remember it. The stock markets, all of them, stay closed through Wednesday. Air travel shut down in the United States until at least noon tomorrow, and certainly no guarantee it'll open after that. That affects, on an average, about 1.5 million people every single day, 40 to 50,000 flights, all of them grounded. There were about 50,000, not 50,000, there were about 50 planes in the air after the FAA essentially locked down airports in the country. All of those planes made it safely to destinations. We don't know they made it to the destinations they were headed for, but they were all able to land safely. CNN's Joey Chin in Atlanta. Joey?
Aaron, we're following and watching these extraordinary pictures as they still come in as we continue to watch all the events. We want to bring our viewers back to where all of this started today, and we have additional pictures to give you some additional perspective to the story we are telling you this afternoon. First up, we go back to 8:48 this morning, that is Eastern. The crash of the first hijacked airliner hit the North Tower of the World Trade Center in Lower Manhattan in New York. You see the gaping hole and you see the black smoke that billowed from the tower. Now this, actually you're looking at the picture of the second airline that crashed into the second tower, the South Tower as well. Now we want to move you over and show you some exclusive CNN pictures, still pictures of the second crash as it happened. You see the plane bearing in on the South Tower of the Trade Center. This is United Airlines Flight 175. It was a Boeing 767 scheduled from Boston to Los Angeles, 65 people on board. And you see what happened, just sheared right into the South Tower. Horrible crash, massive burst of flames. This crash occurred at 4 minutes after 9 o'clock this morning. Again, that's New York time. Now move ahead to 10:30, 10:29 actually. The North Tower had collapsed already. This is the South Tower. You can see collapsing into the streets of Lower Manhattan, just falling away. We know that as you see it there, it's just falling away, just falling out of the sky, falling into pieces all over Lower Manhattan, and so you can understand the tremendous amount of ash just dumped on Lower Manhattan today. Roughly 50,000 people work in the towers in the center area on a daily basis. And then, of course, there are additional tens of thousands of tourists who would come to the tourists who want to see the tremendous vantage point you would have from the top of the towers. The New York City Mayor Rudy Giuliani has told us he does believe that there was a horrendous loss of life there, but he doesn't even want to try to guess how many people have died in New York today. Here now, we want to give you the eyewitness accounts of people who saw some of what happened today.
I heard the sound of a jet. I assumed it was like a Navy jet or something like that, just flying by. Sometimes they'll fly very low, near the World Trade Center, not near it. Then I heard a large explosion. I thought it was a sonic boom. And when I heard the explosion, I looked up, and what I saw red, and I saw debris start to fall down. I was so close to the building that I couldn't run away from the building, so I actually had to run towards it. If you know, the World Financial Center has got a rib design, so you actually have a 2x2 space where you can actually sneak into the building and hide. Myself and one other man were there. We had our book bags over our heads. Debris was falling down about the size of this. All portions of the building were falling down. That went on for about 30 or 40 seconds, and that for me was the worst part of this whole experience for me, because I feared for my own life at that time. Well, after that stopped, I walked out myself. I didn't see anybody in the plaza, so nobody was in the plaza at that point. I walked to my building in the World Financial Center. I'd seen that my colleagues were evacuated the building, were downstairs. Now, on the west side of the World Financial Center, which is right on the Hudson River, there's an outdoor plaza, okay? You can look over the World Financial Center and see the World Trade Center. We were looking back at the building in flames, and this is probably 5 after 9, 10 after 9, and we see a second commercial jet flying extremely low actually collide into the south tower of the building. At that point, we decided just to get out of there. People were just going crazy at that point, evacuating. We started to walk north and ultimately got up to here. During our walk, we saw the south tower collapse to the ground, decimated, and then later, it was very amazing to see the north tower standing there by itself after years and years and years of seeing them together. And then all of a sudden, the north tower just collapsed upon itself and just fell to the ground. It was a cloud of dust that covered all of downtown Manhattan, Battery Park and everything. Phenomenal. I've never seen anything like it.
The eyewitness description of the horrible scene in New York City this morning. And in the midst of all of that, in the midst of that terrible tragedy, there was further chaos down in Washington. 9:45 this morning, an airliner crashing into the Pentagon. The plane, which was American Airlines Flight 77, which was scheduled from Washington's Dulles Airport out to Los Angeles. The Boeing 757 hit the Army side of this huge fortress that is the Pentagon. The Pentagon, of course, is not just a symbol of the nation's military might, but today is a command center amidst all that has happened. Now, there was a fourth crash, which occurred today in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. United Airlines Flight 93 was bound from Newark, New Jersey, out to San Francisco. There were 45 people on board. Authorities say there were no survivors. In all, there were 4 crashes, 266 passengers and crew, and then, of course, we still have no idea how many people may have died on the ground in the course of all these catastrophes. Joining us now from Dallas, Texas is Jeffrey Beatty. He's a counterterrorism expert who had done work on the first World Trade Center attack. That was back in 1993. As well, he's done some work for the Pentagon. Of course, there will be a lot of trying to read through all of this, Mr. Beatty. Is there something that you have seen in the events of today that you see as perhaps a symbol of what group might be involved or some other hallmark of terrorism here?
Well, I think it's a little too early to speculate on what group might be involved, Joey. If you remember back to the Oklahoma City bombing, everyone rushed to judgment to think it was perhaps overseas-based terrorism. Now, while all the indicators are going in that direction, it'd probably be prudent to just focus on the rescue efforts today and also to ask ourselves, how did this happen? And kind of break down the operation and show people that this was a very low-tech but high-concept operation on the part of the terrorists.
Well, describe that for us. What do you mean by that? High concept.
Well, what I mean by that is, Americans tend to rely on high tech. We look to high tech to solve most of our problems. Terrorists don't have high tech at their disposal to the degree that a government such as the United States has. But unfortunately, they have a lot of time. An operation such as this may have been years in the making. We don't know yet how this operation was able to go forward, but let's just, break down the steps. I took a few notes on it. At some point, we all recognized that there was some intelligence failure, that, we've got to do better. We've done good in the past, we've improved our ability to defeat terrorism, but we're not perfect yet, and this is an example of that, to be sure. But then what happened was, the question is, how did these people get some sort of weapon onto an airplane? You know, I'm sure the FAA and the Department of Transportation and all the airports from which these aircraft were launched this morning will be taking a really hard look at that, and I'm sure we'll see some changes in the future.
Not an airplane, Mr. Beatty. I mean, 4 aircraft. That's an awful lot in different locations.
Exactly. This is a highly sophisticated approach, you know, but it's not the first time we've seen that. We've seen foreign groups destroy 2 embassies within moments of each other a couple of years ago on the continent of Africa. So we know that our opponent is capable of this type of operation, and he demonstrated it today on our homeland. The interesting thing here, Joey, you didn't need to bring across hundreds of pounds of explosives across a border someplace to commandeer an airplane. Why did they choose these airplanes? They picked these wide-body airplanes. The fact that the World Trade Center was prepared to sustain a hit from a 707 was not a well-kept secret. They picked airplanes that were bigger than that. Also, they picked airplanes that took off from the East Coast, headed to the West Coast, that were big airplanes full of fuel. They weren't interested in killing people on the airplanes. The airplane themselves became the bomb. And so they didn't need to bring explosives into the country. We don't know yet whether it was knives or handguns or whatever. But the next question in the step as we break down the operational acts in this attack is, how did these people get weapons onto the aircraft? And then from there, to continue it, the question is asked, what about a cockpit incursion? How is it that they were able to get into the cockpits of the aircraft, take over the controls, and as we know and have heard in the past that there are transponder codes that pilots can send if an aircraft is hijacked. From what I understand, we didn't get some of that yet, so we have to assume that the cockpits were burst into rather quickly. And I heard Judy Woodruff and others earlier infer, and I join them in drawing the same inference, that it's highly doubtful that the pilots of these aircraft, the United Airlines pilots and the American Airlines pilots, were at the controls of these aircraft when they impacted their targets. So we have got to assume and infer that people capable of flying the aircraft, and remember these aircraft are on duty all over the world, these perpetrators no doubt rehearsed this operation, rehearsed breaking into the cockpit and other locations, that they were probably piloted to the target by people capable of flying a military or a jet aircraft.
Do you think, I mean, I have to interrupt you to ask, do you think that perhaps in looking at the possibility of terror threats, I mean, certainly terror threats have come to this country in the past, and I'm wondering if you think perhaps we were thinking too high concept. We thought of something more elaborate, and perhaps intelligence should have been focused on this kind of low-tech approach. I suppose hindsight is 20/20, but
I think there's a lot of good in what you're pointing out, Joey. We have to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. You know, we cannot just focus all our energies on weapons of mass destruction, chemical, biological, etc. We've all been talking about that, and hundreds of millions of dollars have been spent on that in recent years. But this didn't use any weapon of mass destruction, and I'm afraid that the casualty tally could approach 5 figures. And that means that we've got to beat these people, not only high tech, but we've got to be high concept. It means we've got to work harder in planning than we have up to this point. And I know that we will. And if I could say a word about the people at the World Trade Center and at the Pentagon, we've had the privilege in my company to work to support both organizations. We've trained every security officer at both locations. They knew what they were up against. They knew that they were icons, American icons, that were likely to be targeted. Excuse me, it's been an emotional day, plus it's a little hot out here. Likely to be targeted. And they did their best. But they were only one part of a system, as we've just outlined. You know, Doug Karpiloff, the Director of Life Safety and Security for the World Trade Center, is probably one of the premier security people in our country. Doug was always afraid of a scenario where there was a mass casualty incident at the World Trade Center and hundreds of emergency vehicles would rush to the scene. They don't have the ability to check all those vehicles to make sure that they don't pose a threat. So we're yet to determine, we've heard reports of secondary explosions after the aircraft impacted, whether in fact there wasn't something else at the base of the towers that in fact were the coup de grace to bring them to the ground.
Mr. Beatty, we appreciate all of your insight. Unfortunately, we're going to have to leave you. There are still further developments on this story. Jeffrey Beatty's company is involved in counterterrorism information, and he joined us this afternoon from Dallas. Now let's go back to New York for the latest information there, and Aaron Brown.
Joey, thank you. A couple of things. The president is en route back to Washington, we are now told. The president had started his day in Sarasota, Florida. then went to Shreveport, a military base outside Shreveport, then went to Nebraska, where the Strategic Air Command is located, and now he is making his way back to Washington. And we are told the president will address the nation at some point tonight. We do not know at what time, but of course, when it happens, we will carry that live as well. We're also getting reports that a second building in the complex of the Trade Center, and again, you have the two towers, but then you have a number of support buildings around it, that another of those buildings, we reported a bit ago on Building 7, we now report that there are problems in Building 5, and that may be collapsing as well, but at least there is fire there. There are enormous logistical problems. We just looked down what is 8th Avenue behind us here, which is normally at this time of the day packed with cars. This is rush hour, people trying to get out of the city. It is empty, and the city, in at least this part of the city, Manhattan, is shut down, which means that thousands of people who are trying to get home, trying to get to the suburbs, trying to get to Long Island, trying to get to New Jersey particularly, that's where those trains, what are called the PATH trains, come into New Jersey, from New Jersey rather, at the Trade Center. All of them stranded here. CNN's Richard Roth is down on the streets of New York and is talking to some of the people who I suspect are wondering when they will get home. Richard?
People that you would have seen in locations you were just examining, many thousands are here right now on the west side of Manhattan trying to escape from New York. New York City is sending them to ferries that are taking them to New Jersey. New York City bridges, we're told, are open for pedestrians. The tunnels for trains to take the thousands here were closed. Many of these people stunned, shocked, silence. I mean, you've never heard so many New Yorkers so quiet in your life. And many of them just have to look over their shoulders to see what they escaped as these two towers were leveled. New York City Mayor Rudolph Giuliani called it one of the most heinous acts in United States history. He says he fears that the death toll may be more than New York can bear. He asked all New Yorkers to say a prayer. He said a rescue effort was beginning, but as we were told by one official with the New York, New Jersey Port Authority, there is so much jet fuel, furniture, paper, everything still going on up in smoke. He didn't want to send in his people to begin any type of detailed rescue effort. There are reports of some people alive, many dead down there. Scores, hundreds of emergency vehicles with their sirens have been roaring down Manhattan's west side here to the scene, carrying federal security people, all kinds. Mayor Rudolph Giuliani said that there are more than 1,000 people taken to what's known as Liberty State Park, the walking wounded, he called them, several hundred, 600 or so in New York City hospitals. And the mayor said that there are 170 hospitals that are up and running, and other buildings are helping out for support. U.S. jet fighters overhead, circling occasionally, people craning their necks, looking up in the sky. Everybody's got a memory, everybody's got a story here. I personally saw Trade Tower #1, where CNN's New York bureau used to be in the lobby 17, 18 years ago, come tumbling down, and I was part of a stampede as people just raced for their lives as the smoke came closer and closer to all of us. That was after Tower #2 had gone down. You couldn't even see what was left of it, if anything was standing, due to all of the smoke. Aaron.
Richard, just help orient me for a second. Tell me where you are in the city right now as you talk to us.
We're on approximately 33rd Street on the west side of Manhattan. The Hudson River is just behind our camera position here, and it is an orderly departure here. I mean, you can see for yourself. People are just they left work early. They were ordered out. The city is on high alert. No flights, and people are headed to New Jersey. Many of them would be at the ferry at this time on a normal day. This is certainly not a very normal day in New York City.
It certainly is not, Richard. Thank you. It is, I don't know if remarkable is the right word, but it's worth noting again that in every picture that we have seen from the scene, the people who had just experienced the most horrendous imaginable thing were remarkably orderly and calm as they left the area. I don't want to suggest for a second that there wasn't any panic, that there wasn't any screaming. These are human beings, and human beings behave in a variety of ways. But every picture we have seen, New Yorkers calmly, if that's the right word, calmly left the scene, moved out of the area. No reports of trouble at all as firefighters and police personnel came down into the city. Scores, hundreds of civilians started to move out. and they are still calmly moving out. We suspect there is some sense of shock as they try and figure out what has happened to their city, what has happened to their lives, and perhaps most importantly, what has happened to their friends and their co-workers who may not have gotten out of those buildings today. One of the problems that the city is faced with is, and as Richard alluded to, is moving people around. You have essentially a shutdown going on here. In some of the outlying areas, city governments are trying to support the city as best they can. Tom Swayze is the mayor of Glen Cove out on Long Island. Tom, I think you're on the phone. Mr. Mayor, can you hear me?
Yes, this is Tom Swayze, mayor of the city of Glen Cove.
Tom, tell us what Glen Cove is doing to support the efforts going on here in Manhattan.
We have high-speed ferries that operate from Glen Cove to Pier 11 down by Wall Street. And we've already evacuated about 1,200 people with the help of Fox Navigation from New York City out here back to the island. We are now working at the request of Commissioner Carrick to try and bring emergency personnel, doctors, nurses back into Manhattan to try and help relieve some of these doctors and nurses that are going to start getting very exhausted at the area hospitals down on the southern tip of Manhattan.
And is there a number people should call or a location they ought to go to if they are medical personnel and can help in the effort down there, where they can get on one of these ferries and come on down?
We'd like them to come to the end of Glen Cove Road, the northern end of Glen Cove Road in Glen Cove, to the parking lot across from our police station, the end of Glen Cove Road, across from the Glen Cove Police Station, where we will take them by bus down to the ferry terminal. If they want to call for information, they should call the ferry terminal itself at 609-3342, 609-3342. We're coordinating with the Nassau County and Suffolk County emergency management offices as well, but right now we need to get emergency-type personnel, doctors, nurses, EMTs. We know everybody wants to help, but we're not looking for just regular volunteers who mean well, and we appreciate their interest. We're looking for professionals who can go into Manhattan and be prepared to work.
Tom, thank you for joining us and for your efforts today. I apologize for mispronouncing your name a moment ago. Thank you. Judy in Washington.
Aaron, we're here in the Washington studio, and among others, I'm joined by former U.S. Secretary of State Alexander Haig, former Army General Haig. You were, of course, Secretary of State during the Ronald Reagan administration. And, Mr. Secretary, you were in that post at a time of a national emergency, the assassination attempt on the life of President Reagan. And what I want to specifically ask you about is, what is it like for the people on the inside, the heartbeat of government, when something horrific like this happens? Of course, this is a very different situation, but what is it like when you have to react to something?
Well, I think most people wait and look for direction, and so it's very important that they have it. If they don't, they sometimes sit in shocked inaction, and so you have to have that. And that's the critical aspect of moving through a crisis of this kind.
And we've heard from President Bush now at 3 different intervals today, when he was still in Florida, when he moved on to Louisiana, and then a statement when he was in Nebraska. Now we know he's back to Washington. Now let me ask you, he's coming back to the Washington area. We don't know where he's going to go. Vice President Cheney at an undisclosed location. The Speaker of the House, second in line to the presidency, at an undisclosed location. I'm not asking you to tell us where they are, but what would it be like in one of these locations where they were essentially kept away and kept safe?
Well, all of these installations have been established for precisely this reason. And that means that they're armed with communications, with living facilities, and that's the situation. Now, they don't exercise them all as regularly as I suppose we used to during the nuclear era, but they still exercise them, and they're very, very efficient facilities.
You're saying they don't exercise, presumably because it's felt that the threat isn't as serious in the post-Cold War world?
Well, it's, you know, government is tough, and people are always responding to the crisis of the moment. Usually it's in the first headlines in the daily press. So many times they don't get to go to these relocation sites, as often as we'd like. And I used to have to push that when I was in the National Security Council.
The exercises where you would practice what you would do in an emergency. But once they're at the site, I mean, are we talking about very spare surroundings, bare walls, canned goods for food? I mean, what are we talking about?
It varies. It varies. Of course, there's an airborne facility. We all know that there is an airborne facility for the president, and that's Andrews Air Force Base. There are other facilities, some very, very close and some more distant, which were anticipated might be required in a nuclear attack.
What about the lines of communication? You mentioned that. That was the first point you made, that once they're at these locations, there has to be communications. How up to date is all that?
Well, it's kept pretty well up to date. I know, for example, the day President Reagan was shot, it was very clear to me that that command post, that command and control center, had to be in the west basement of the White House or in one of these alternate emergency facilities, because they were equipped to do precisely that. Now, since that time, we've improved the State Department communication facilities, and the Pentagon, of course, is very well equipped in that regard. So there are 3 locations that you could run a crisis from that are known, but there are others.
General Haig, what do you say to those Americans watching this horrific set of circumstances unfold on television before them and wondering, is America safe? Is America safe? Do I feel safe getting on an airplane and flying somewhere? Am I safe to go into a tall building in Manhattan, to walk into a federal building in Washington, D.C., anywhere, whether it's touring the White House or the Capitol? I mean, what has today done to our sense of safety?
The answer to your question, Judy, is obviously whatever we've done heretofore has not been adequate from the standpoint of your question. And that's been a product of a number of things. It's what I call the modern-day rationalization of conflict situations, and what I call the development of moral equivalence between the terrorist, who's the perpetrator of the illegal act, where innocent civilians, non-combatants, women, children, everyone are involved, and the defenders against those attacks are equated morally because of some perception of a lack of social justice on one side or the other. And, you know, we're very great, we're moralists here in this country, and we do that. The simple facts are that national leadership has to establish that terrorism is an illegal act of such magnitude now that it overwhelms the issues of social justice, which cause us to quibble and restrain us at a time when a crime of this nature has been executed.
You're saying even over individual liberties in some instances?
Well, sometimes yes, and that's an unfortunate statement as an advocate of those very liberties. But yes, sometimes.
Former Secretary of State Alexander Haig, Army General Alexander Haig, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you, Judy.
We appreciate it. And we just heard General Haig talking about terrorism and how much greater a presence it is in our lives than we had expected. We're told that tomorrow the Congress will convene at 10 o'clock in the morning. We're told that they plan to pass a resolution or resolutions condemning terrorism and then immediately adjourn. You're looking at a live picture of the United States Capitol, the flag flying at half staff there. Now that is the White House. That's next to the Executive Office building, but the other picture we saw was a flag flying at half staff near the United States Capitol building. Now back to Joey Chen in Atlanta.
Judy, thanks very much. Joined here on the set by Miles O'Brien, who is our resident pilot and certainly has quite a bit of understanding about the wheres and why-fors and what significance they might have in putting together what happened. Miles has some additional information now, and that's really important to understanding who might have done this and why.
Well, this is sort of our first clue as to what's going on. Obviously, more information will come out as the air traffic control tapes and hopefully the cockpit voice recordings come out. But just take a look at this. This is actual archival information from the radar tracks. from the FAA ground centers. And these are the two planes which ultimately ended up at the World Trade Centers, the two towers. Both of them left Boston within 15 minutes of each other. Both were headed to Los Angeles, perhaps no coincidence, heavily laden with fuel. Both of them made extreme and noticeable deviations and were heading in the wrong direction for 30, perhaps 40 minutes, thus clearly giving air traffic controllers quite a bit of attention. There must have been some communication back and forth. It's unclear now.
This is certainly something the air traffic control folks would have seen. They would have seen these things
clearly.
coming up close.
And the fact that two planes were doing this must have seemed odd. We don't know what the conversations were, but suffice to say that would be odd. Now take a look at this flight. This is United 93. This took off from Dulles Airport, was headed for San Francisco. Once again, a coast-to-coast flight, heavily laden with fuel, flew on out from Newark to about Cleveland, then took its dogleg, was headed pretty much to the D.C. area.